Government Business Order of the Day number 1, Telecommunications Legislation Amendment, Access Regime and NBN Companies Bill 2015, resumption of debate on the second reading.
I call the member for McEwen.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. 2 years ago this week, 3rd of March 2014, I rose in this place and said, Mr Abbott and the Liberals are pulling the plug on the national broadband network, fibre rollout in my electorate. Well, the result of this decision has been enormous. We have become an electorate of the haves and have-nots. We've already seen people being forced to move away from the electorate purely because they cannot get access to high-speed broadband. Children in my communities do not have access to educational resources. Businesses do not have the same connectivity to customers and wholesalers alike. 2 years later, we have a new Prime Minister and a new Minister for Communications. 2 years later, we're told there's never been a more exciting time to be an Australian. But I can tell you, 2 years later, there has never been a worse time to be a resident of McEwen who had their hopes pinned on receiving fast and affordable broadband under the failure that is the Abbott-Turnbull government. In suburbs like Mernda and Doreen, there has never been a worse time for a kid studying for a VCE. In places like Sunbury, there's never been a worse time for local businesses trying to compete on the global stage. And why? Because Mr There has never been a more exciting time was the Communications Minister for 2 years and now is the Prime Minister. 2 years of when basically his only job was to get the NBN right. But it was 2 years of mismanagement and neglect. 2 years of spending more time scheming to wrestle the job from the member for Warringah than doing his own job. And as we know, with Malcolm, it's all about Malcolm. And what do we have? What does the Prime Minister have to show for his 2 years of effort? The NBN that Mr Turnbull has left behind us is an absolute mess, and this bill will go nowhere to actually fixing it. The Prime Minister promised that the second-rate NBN, his version of the NBN, would be rolled out faster and cheaper. Nothing could be further from the truth. The cost of this NBN has just doubled, from $29.5 billion to $56 billion. He promised that it would be rolled out to all Australians by the end of 2016. Now, he's doubled that for another 7 years. We are told that this bill will enhance the regulatory framework for telecommunications, implementing, in part, the government's response to the Vertigan panel. Well, let's have a look at what the Vertigan panel and what has been said about its work. The Senate Select Committee into the NBN put the Vertigan panel's independent cost-benefit analysis under the microscope in 2015, and what they found was concerning, including fatal shortcomings in the analysis. These included the absurdly pessimistic quantification of technical household demand, 15 megabits per second by 2023. That relied on a study conducted by a UK firm known for its uniquely pessimistic view of broadband demand, rather than the demand of forecasts from reputable firms like Cisco. The Select Committee also said that, incredibly, the panel inflated NBN Co's fibre operating expenditure assumptions by 180%, compared to only 12% for the Malcolm Turnbull mess, despite the low operating costs of fibre compared to legacy technologies. But the Select Committee wasn't alone when they examined the credibility of the report. Telecommunications analyst Chris Coughlin observed that it is clear that in commissioning the National Broadband Network reviews, the government has carefully selected consultants, analysts and economists that have previously expressed views that support their position. IBRS analyst Guy Cranswick didn't hold back when he described the cost-benefit analysis as politically stacked, and the panel of experts is full of acolytes and sympathisers with the coalition government. Professor Graham Samuel, a former head of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, observed that multiple reviews at vast costs are being completed, primarily focused on demonstrating the Labor government's NBN concept was flawed or was less economically viable than the coalition. Unfortunately, much of this review analysis has had a political tarnish, which diminishes its value in forward planning for this important infrastructure project. The Select Committee concluded that the cost-benefit analysis is deeply flawed and overtly political document. It is not credible and is not a reliable basis on which to make decisions about the NBN. Since the Select Committee conducted its analysis of the Vertigan panel's cost-benefit analysis, developments have borne out its conclusion. The Vertigan panel based its cost assumptions for the government's NBN on the cost models developed by NBN Co for the 2013 strategic review. These cost models have proven to be hopelessly wrong, as the cost of the government's second-rate NBN has blown out from the $41 billion assumed in December 2013 strategic review up to the $56 billion assumed in NBN Co's August 2015 Corporate Plan 2016. Malcolm Turnbull's assumptions in the strategic review are not even close. When he released the strategic review, he said it was the most thorough and objective analysis of the NBN ever provided to Australians. He said, importantly, all forecasts in the strategic review have been arrived at independently by NBN Co, and in the view of the company and its expert advisors, are both conservative and achievable. We know this Prime Minister likes to talk. He won't give you a 3-word slogan, but he'll punish you with a 5,000-word essay. But when it comes to action, he has a problem. He cannot walk the walk. We know that this bill is on some very, very rocky foundations. Foundations built when this Prime Minister was in charge of the NBN. And let's look at how these foundations he put down in the electorate of McEwen. Labor had a plan for McEwen, a firm plan for our local communities to receive fast and affordable broadband. Under Labor, places like Mernda and Doreen would have the NBN by now. Under Malcolm Turnbull, it is supposedly being started in 2017. That's 4 years. People in my communities, the fastest growing communities in Australia, do not have access to broadband, and it's because of the failure of this government. Under Labor, Sunbury would have finished construction of the NBN by 2016. Under Malcolm Turnbull, they are supposedly starting construction in 2016. And let's remember at the last election, their candidate went out and said NBN's fine. We don't need faster speed broadband, it's acceptable. So that's just a couple of communities that I mentioned. These delays are not just shifting dates on paper. They affect real people in their lives. They affect school kids and they affect businesses. They make us a community of have-nots. Take, for instance, Barbara Marshall, an international design consultant who, with her husband Alan, provides multimedia, digital and animation design services. Says that they made a conscious decision to work from their Doreen home to avoid the long travels into the city. She said, as an industry, technology norms have changed to the delivery of large files via internet, we are struggling to service our clients' expectations. With a maximum of wireless 15 gig a month from Telstra, our only option, it makes our business uncompetitive. The limit on availability of high-speed broadband is directly affecting our productivity and our ability to employ more young designers. Take EcoMaster, a family-owned business that was in Gisborne. It designs, produces and distributes customised thermal solutions for houses and businesses across the country. EcoMaster's owners, Lynn and Morris, heavily rely on the internet to run their business. But with constant interruptions, slow speeds of their then current service, it become almost impossible to conduct business in the local area. Lynn said, we would love to continue running our business here in Gisborne, but with the NBN rollout not continuing through this region, it may just be that we have to move our business to Melbourne. And unfortunately, for people in Gisborne, they did. They moved to Melbourne, which means a loss of jobs for employees. We have waited so long for the NBN to be delivered in our communities that one council, the City of Whittlesea, was so sick and tired of this government and their inferior NBN and slow rollout, they went it alone. Mernda and Lorimer are suburbs with around 20,000 young residents. Work will not start on the NBN until 2017. If you can believe the Wentworth Waffler, he says it'll be there by 2018. That's not the case. They're already 3 years behind and it will just keep growing and growing. Most residents can't even access ADSL, and a few pockets of new builds have NBN, but most of the area just have to struggle. In 2010, the City of Whittlesea spent hundreds of thousands in infrastructure, making sure the suburbs were ready for NBN so they could be close to the first in the rollout. And they did, under Labor. South Morang was one of the first places to get fibre optic cable direct to the home. But since the election, they have been put to the bottom of the list. Whittlesea invited companies to make use of council's underground service conduits, allowing companies to run high-speed internet cabling to reach homes not connected by the NBN. Even the former Liberal Mayor of Whittlesea couldn't support the Abbott-Turnbull government's dud rollout plan when he said council is committed to ensuring our community gains access to high-speed internet, which is so essential for our residents and businesses to make the most of the digital age. Red Train Networks were successful as the carrier from an EOI process to be provided the opportunity to access council's conduit and bring additional broadband to local residents not currently served with high-speed broadband. This network offers fibre to premises and services up to 1 gigabyte per second. They started building their network in March 2015 and have been identifying customers who didn't want to wait the 3+ years for the MTM technology to be deployed. Whittlesea Council rollout for the fibre to the premises is underway in the next few months. Whittlesea Council have been forced to deliver a proper NBN service for its residents and roll out quicker than ever Malcolm Turnbull ever could. Mr Turnbull promised us fast and cheaper NBN, which would be rolled out to all homes and businesses by the end of 2016. We now see that these, even with the unrealistic revised proposals, we will not even see work begin until 2 years later. When it will reach its completion, that's anyone's guess. While I'm talking about local issues, this bill attempts to reflect the legislation of the government's policy of axing the universal national wholesale pricing and replacing it with wholesale price caps. Universal national wholesale pricing is a reform introduced by the former Labor government. What it means is people living in rural and regional areas will not be penalised, and pay the same wholesale price for equivalent services in the cities. Now, you would have thought that's something the National Party would have supported. But as usual, when it comes to Canberra, the National Party is silent. They do not support rural and regional broadband and users getting the same pricing as those in the city. Says a lot about the National Party and why they lost party status in Victoria. Axing this reform means that all Australians will be paying more for essential communications, and Labor does not support the government's move to access universal wholesale pricing. And it's a loss. It's a loss why the National Party would support this change. As I said, 2 years ago, I stood in this place and pleaded with the then Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, and Communications Minister Turnbull not to wreck the NBN in our community. They did not listen. For those who have been lucky enough to have been connected, and they are few and far between, we have a second-class broadband network that has been delivered for twice the price. So much for the great economic managers that the Conservatives like to pat themselves on the back and claim they are. For those who have not been able to connect due to neglect and the failures of this Prime Minister, I'll recommit to you that we will make sure you receive fast and expressive broadband that you deserve. Now, earlier today, the lead speaker of the government spent 15 minutes talking and spent less than 2 minutes talking about NBN. He talked about black spot towers. I just want to remind him that the way the so-called black spot towers were rolled out. In New South Wales, there was 144 towers rolled out. Labor electorates received 12. In Victoria, there was 110 towers rolled out. Labor electorates only received 12. This just showed that this program is not working. It's not working because the three criteria that the government lauded itself about, rural and regional, close to major transport routes and prone to natural disasters, they didn't even follow that. This was a pork barrelling exercise to ensure that they looked after their own mates in their own regions. We also had the member for Grey come in here and said, and I quote, "There was not a cigarette paper between Labor and the Liberals when it comes to broadband." Well, Deputy Speaker, we've heard that before in education. Look how that went. So if we go by the member for Grey's words, you can be assured that a re-elected Liberal government will not give you high-speed broadband now or into the future.
Thank the member for McEwen. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Lawler.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise Happily to make a contribution to this debate on the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment 2015. And I do so because, as I have often been on my feet to talk about the absolute mess that this government has made of the NBN, of the great national broadband network. This government today has gutted its own bill and removed the sections that were contentious, the contentious elements that Labor opposed. Cynically, perhaps, because talking about telecommunications and the second-rate NBN is not what this government wants to do today. And, of course, Deputy Speaker, that's not surprising when they woke this morning to headlines on the front page of the this morning, Turnbull's NBN plan in crisis. Now, we saw today in question time that the Prime Minister would like to hide behind the new minister, but Australia knows who is responsible. Australia knows who stood at that dispatch box in opposition and slated Labor's plan for an NBN. Australia knows who has been responsible from the first 2 years of this government, who was Communications Minister. This government today has been forced into a humiliating backdown on its own bill that it was bringing into this chamber. The amendments introduced today by the government follow to the letter Labor's recommendations in its dissenting report. Some might see this as common sense, others might see it as a government that would like to close down a debate and get a piece of legislation through before we all get up to talk about our experiences with the NBN. Deputy Speaker, the bill was misguided. It was an ideological attempt by this government to roll back a number of competition and consumer-friendly reforms underpinning the NBN. And in the electorate of Lalor, the people I represent, are living the digital divide that has been created by this government in the last 2.5 years. They are acutely aware of the mess that is this government's NBN. They're acutely aware that at an election they promised that it would be faster, cheaper, and that they would have it sooner. They're acutely aware that it is slower, more expensive, and that the timelines for the delivery of the NBN have stretched under this government. And it is worth looking at the history of the NBN, in particular the utterances of our now Prime Minister, the member for Wentworth, who was, of course, responsible in his portfolio. And while in opposition, then Shadow Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull said, "We are going to do a rigorous analysis. We will get Infrastructure Australia to do an independent cost-benefit analysis." But of course that was before the election. After the election, instead of appointing Infrastructure Australia as promised, the Prime Minister, now Prime Minister, appointed the Verticum panel, a panel made up of former Liberal Party staffers and strident critics of the NBN. Who better to do an analysis on the NBN than people that thought it shouldn't exist? The Verticum panel, responsible for the initial provisions in the bill, based its cost-benefit analysis on certain assumptions that were hopelessly, outrageously and embarrassingly wrong. And, Deputy Speaker, what was the industry response to the Verticum report? Well, the industry response was scathing. The Competitive Carriers Coalition released a statement calling on the recommendations to be binned. I'm sure they're pleased today that they've seen some of those recommendations in the amendments before us today being binned. They said that after deliberating all year, the Verticum panel has recommended that Australia look to emulate 1970s US telephone industry policy to promote investment in 21st century broadband networks. Most of the Verticum recommendations represent nothing more than rehashed, discredited, theoretical arguments promoted by opponents of regulatory reform and opponents of the NBN. Deputy Speaker, Labor is pleased the government is finally heeding the recommendations of industry and is binning the recommendations of the Verticum review in this chamber today. But I have to spend some time this evening, Deputy Speaker, talking about the NBN in the electorate of Lalor, because I've done it so many times in this place since coming here in the 2013 election, because there are so many people in my community that are having a difficulty accessing any kind of internet service, let alone the NBN. Last year, I sent out a broadband survey to connect with residents about the problems they are facing. The survey showed suburbs like Tarneet, Truganina, Wyndham Vale and Point Cook are riddled with internet black holes, where ADSL 1 is not available to residents, where there's a waiting list to get onto a port so that you can get ADSL, where many residents are paying high costs to access 4G and other options because they cannot connect to broadband. Many are also fibre ready, so new areas being built, they're fibre ready, but there are no NBN co plans to provide that fibre. These estates have to rely on wireless access because no new copper has been rolled out. If you live in Point Cook, Wyndham Vale or Seabrook, you will be waiting until 2018 to get off your ADSL, if you have it, or to get from wireless onto something that is a reliable speed. And of course, inside each of those suburbs, there are areas of Wyndham Vale that have the originally planned Labor Party NBN, fibre to the home. And those people are singing its praises, while across the road, their neighbours cannot get ADSL 1. In Lawler, there have been no new areas added to the NBN rollout since the 2013 election. So sooner? I don't think so, Prime Minister. And in our growing community, the NBN is a necessity. It is critical for small and medium businesses to be on the NBN. We're talking about a community where people can be in the snarl of a traffic jam for an hour and a half in the morning and an hour and a half in the evening. Many opt to run a micro business or a small business from home or locally, and many are struggling. Many are struggling to make a profit in those businesses because of limited access to what is now a requirement for business. And most residents have no idea when they will be receiving the NBN. I recently received an email, one of many, from a gentleman in Wyndham Vale. He said, "When I made an inquiry to the NBN about laying their network in my current area, they are either not sure or they don't know how much time it will take to start laying cables in our area." His email is representative of the dozens of emails I receive a week on the NBN. From a Wyndham Vale man, "I am writing you this email to raise the unavailability of phone connections and internet services in our area. I have recently purchased my own house in Wyndham Vale, but I am unable to get this very basic facility of internet at my place because of lack of ports in the area, as per told by every provider, including Telstra. And I am wondering what is the reason for lack of ports, as the latest internet provision NBN has been started in the area just across Ballan Road." So the man asks reasonably. When? The man asks reasonably, why can my neighbour access this and I am left not just with last century, but any of our collective memories? Last year, I received a complaint from a concerned mother. And as a former teacher, I understand the pressure of students coming home. Their schools are digitally ready, and they come home and they have all of the equipment. They have the hardware in the house, but they cannot access internet at a speed will allow them to do the downloads or the uploads that these students need. Deputy Speaker, this is a matter of equity. This mother wrote, "Our internet connection is very slow, impacting on our daily lives and on our children currently doing VCE. It is unacceptable considering our world and society is now heavily based on technology." Deputy Speaker, we sit here now listening to a Prime Minister talk about innovation. A Prime Minister who has cut funding to education and who has made a mess of the NBN, who has created a digital divide. He said everyone in Australia would have the NBN this year, and that promise is just not going to be met. There are areas in my electorate for the rollout won't start at least until 2018. There are other areas who will not get the NBN. It's clear, they're in the documentation released by the NBN Co. They promised high-speed internet by 2016. He said he would get it to all homes in Australia by this year, and that's now blown out more than double to 2020. federal government's handling of the project has been nothing short of a disaster. It is a farce, but it's a farce that's hurting people all over this country. It's hurting people in my electorate. Our now Prime Minister had one job as Minister for Communications, one job. And over the last 2.5 years, he had one job, to build the NBN. But he has failed. It is an absolute disaster. We know that it's facing mounting delays and rising costs, and the reason we know this is from yet another leaked document. Another leaked document, because the transparency around the NBN is such that we don't know what's going on until we get a leak from the department. A shroud of secrecy has descended over this project since Prime Minister took over as the former Minister and Prime Minister, with basic information previously made public under Labor that is now hidden. So today we saw another leaked document from NBN Co that revealed that the Prime Minister's second-rate copper NBN is hopelessly delayed and over budget. So it's going to cost twice as much as Labor's fibre to the home, and what we're going to get is copper to the street corner. That relies on mains power. We're rolling out reams and reams of copper when we should have optic fibre. Deputy Speaker, as a principal in a school years ago, we put an optic fibre in our schools ready for the NBN. And now those schools could be faced with copper at the gate. Deputy Speaker, it is a disaster. Now, the Prime Minister said today in question time that we should let the facts speak for themselves. Well, here we have something we can agree on. Let the fact speak for themselves, Prime Minister. He said his second-rate NBN would cost $29.5 billion. We know now it will cost almost double, up to $56 billion and growing. He said that his second-rate copper NBN would cost $600 per home for connection. This cost has nearly tripled to $1,600 a home. He said it would cost $55 million to patch up the old copper network. This cost has blown out by more than 1,000% to more than $640 million. For copper, for last century's technology. He said that 2.61 million homes would be connected to the pay TV cables by 2016. NBN is now forecasting they will connect only 10,000 homes by June 2016. I agree, Prime Minister, let the facts speak for themselves. He said his second-rate network would bring in $2.5 billion in revenue in 2016 and 17. This has crashed to $1.1 billion. He has blown a $1.4 billion hole in NBN Co's revenue line. Deputy Speaker, time is running out. The excuses are getting longer. Australians know who is responsible. And the people in my community, they deserve better than the ever-increasing waits, than what this government, they deserve better than what is being delivered. The Prime Minister saw the creation of a digital divide that is embedding in my community, not shrinking under this government. And Deputy Speaker, we've heard a lot in the last few days about the price of housing. We've heard the Prime Minister waffle lyrical at that dispatch box about his knowledge about how much houses cost all over this country. Does he know that in my electorate, the key decider on what a house is worth is now whether or not it gets access to the NBN? That's now creating a bubble in a housing market in the electorate of Lalor. It's playing out in our community, this digital divide. It's having an impact everywhere. The community I represent needs a Prime Minister that will do more than invest in telecommunications. They need a Prime Minister who will invest in this country's future. There is no innovation without education. There is no innovation without a decent NBN for people all over this country. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Thank the member for Lawler. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Franklin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Access Regime and NBN Companies Bill 2015, as introduced by this government, of course, just shows what a mess the government is in with its NBN. We see it day in, day out. We, of course, saw it today on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald through a leaked NBN internal document. But we don't need to read about it in the paper to know what a mess it is. All you've got to do is go out and talk to your constituents or read your emails to know what a mess the NBN is in Australia under this government. And indeed, under the Prime Minister, when he was Communications Minister, the mess that was made of the NBN rollout. In my home state of Tasmania, of course, before the last federal election, we were promised that the NBN would be a faster speed, that it would be delivered sooner, and that it would be cheaper. And of course, we now know that that is not true, not just for Tasmania, but for the whole country. Indeed, in their election document, pre-election document, the Liberal Party promised in Tasmania, in black and white, that the full NBN rollout in Tasmania would be completed by 2015. Completed by 2015. Now, since that time, we've had not one home or premises connected to the Liberal Party's second-rate copper fibre to the node. Not one in Tasmania connected to their NBN. Not one. So since their election in 2013, we've had a whole range of excuses from Liberal members in Tasmania, and I was astounded earlier in this debate today to see the member for Lyons stand up and talk about the NBN in Tasmania and talk about good news for his electorate. I'm sure his constituents do not agree, Deputy Speaker, that it's good news that their NBN's going to be a couple of years later than they were promised. I'm sure that his constituents are not pleased with the good news that the NBN may be costing more in regional Australia, thanks to the part in this bill where the government is seeking to change the wholesale price. Indeed, what they're suggesting in the original bill is that the wholesale price will be different in regional Australia compared to what it is in the cities. And people in regional Australia should be outraged by this suggestion. The member for Lyons, the member for Bass indeed, and the member for Braddon from Tasmania should be outraged by this suggestion. And I'm not sure where the Nationals in the coalition are on this matter, because I would be astounded to hear the National members come into this parliament and support wholesale price differential in rural and regional Australia compared to the cities. It is an outrageous suggestion that people in the cities should get the NBN cheaper, because of course the NBN was designed to overcome the tyranny of distance. So why would you make it more expensive for the people that will need it the most, the people in rural and regional Australia? It doesn't make sense. Now, I understand the government has decided that it will cut that part out of the bill in its amendments that it intends to move. So I am pleased to hear that that is the case, although I'm not sure on what motivation that is and whether or not it might come back, because certainly the Vertican report, which has led to this bill, suggested wholesale pricing and a differential in wholesale pricing. So I'm not sure whether the government's now saying that it doesn't agree with the Vertican report that it commissioned full of its own Liberal Party experts and Liberal Party advisors, rather than the Infrastructure Australia full cost analysis, which the Prime Minister promised before the election and of course didn't do. So I'm not sure whether or not the government is suggesting that it no longer agrees with the Vertican report or not. Certainly they were out trumpeting it at the time, and certainly they used the assumptions in that report used figures that were completely wrong, and we've found out today are completely wrong. Indeed, what we heard was that Malcolm Turnbull, or the Prime Minister, said his second-rate NBN would cost $29.5 billion, but we now know it will cost almost double at $56 billion. We of course heard that from him that we would get his second-rate NBN to all Australian homes by this year, 2016, but we now know that that time frame has pushed out to 2020. We of course heard that the second-rate copper NBN would cost around $600 per home, and that this cost is now $1,600 a home. And then of course there was the state of the old copper network, which would need to be upgraded, and of course the assumptions here were just quite extraordinary. because we were told it would cost around $55 million to patch up the old copper network. Now, I don't know, obviously they hadn't been out and seen any of it. I've certainly seen some in my electorate, and it needs more than a patch-up, because, of course, it's now come out that it's about $640 million to fix the existing copper network because it is so degraded. So degraded. But they should have already known that, Deputy Speaker. We heard today from one of the ministers that, you know, he used to work in the industry. He should have known what condition that copper was in. The government should have known what condition that copper was in. And it's just remarkable that they would have said it would only cost $55 million to patch up, and it's now $640 million. And then, of course, there was the assumption that 2.6 million homes will be connected via pay TV cables by 2016. And of course, we now know that NBN is forecasting that they'll only connect around 10,000 homes by June 2016. And we heard that the second-rate network would bring in about $2.5 billion in revenue, and this has now crashed to around $1.1 billion in revenue. We also, of course, heard before the election that the satellites that were going up were not required. Indeed, the then Minister for Communications said prior to the election, the Minister for Communications, or the current Prime Minister, said prior to the election, there is enough capacity on private satellites already in orbit or scheduled for launch for the NBN to deliver broadband to the 200,000 or so premises in remote Australia without NBN Co having to build its own. Well, how wrong was he? And indeed, he actually went to the launch of the satellite, I believe, stood there and tried to claim credit for it. And we've had now members from the other side stand up and talk about the wireless satellite access that people will be getting and have been getting because of the satellite that Labor suggested needed to go up. And we heard from them in opposition, when they were in opposition, that these satellites were not required and that private capacity was already there. And now we know that that's not true. So many errors. And what a debacle it has been. And yet today, when getting questions here in question time, we heard nothing really from the Prime Minister to explain what went wrong. Why are we now hearing about the cost blowouts? Why are we now hearing about the timeframe blowouts? Why is it not faster, sooner and cheaper as we were promised? As we were promised prior to the last election. You know, they've been in government for 2.5 years. It would be interesting to see in the next updates or the next lot of documents that suddenly appear in a newspaper about what the forecasts are going to be in coming months as we go into the election campaign, because my constituents in my electorate have really had enough of it. There are still parts in my electorate where people can't even get ADSL. People cannot even get ADSL. They cannot wait for Malcolm Turnbull's slower to turn up, slower speeds, second-rate copper NBN. They cannot wait. They need internet services now. They are moving out of suburbs. They can't do their kids can't do their homework. They can't log online to their work emails. It is absolutely disgraceful that in Australia, in this day and age, when we come into this place and talk about jobs and innovation and jobs of the future, that Australia is in this position. That we're in a position where we are not getting the world's best technology, where we have got a complete mess of a national broadband network rollout. We've got other countries in the world that are moving to fibre to the premise, which was what, of course, we committed to when we were in government, and of course this government has backtracked on. Countries around the world realise that fibre to the premise is the way of the future. And instead, we've got a messed up, second-rate NBN going out. I'll have constituents in my electorate that'll be the haves and the have-nots. We have people, as I said, without internet access at all, but we will soon have, I understand, in about 6 or 7 months' time, people that'll be the first people in my electorate to be connected to fibre to the node. I have fibre to the premise at my home, as does a lot of other people in my electorate. Fibre to the premise. Labor's real NBN. Labor's real NBN. And indeed, it's the NBN that everybody in my electorate wants and that everybody in my electorate thought that they were going to get. One of the reasons everybody in my electorate thought they were going to get it was because of a letter to the editor. When I raised the NBN prior to the last federal election, I was accused of a scare campaign by Liberal Senator for Tasmania David Bushby. Indeed, in a letter to the editor, he actually says Julie Collins is running a scare campaign. There will be no difference in who gets fibre to their home in Tasmania under Labor or Liberal. Quote from Senator David Bushby in the newspaper prior to the last federal election. My constituents firmly believed that they were getting fibre to the premise. Fibre to the premise that some of my constituents actually have, as I said. Other constituents don't have the internet at all, and some are going to get fibre to the node second rate who want fibre to the premise. There are whole suburbs and small towns in my electorate that still don't know when they're going to get the NBN. Go and look up their address on the NBN co-map and they still actually have no idea when they're getting it after being promised the full rollout would be completed by 2015. So we have a situation in my home state where you've got Liberal members coming in here saying how wonderful their NBN is and how grateful their electorate should be and what great news it is, when the truth is actually starkly different. Starkly different. Out and about in Tasmania, no matter where you go, people complaining about the internet access, except of course for those which have Labor's fibre to the premise, Labor's real NBN, because they know the value of Labor's real NBN and everybody else has seen it and everybody else wants it because they know of the value and they know of the innovation and the jobs that will come with that. Tasmania, under the Labor Party, was going to be the first state to be fully connected to the NBN, the first state. We, of course, don't think that that's going to be the case now, and we still don't know when the NBN rollout will be fully complete in Tasmania. As I said, I've got small towns and suburbs that still don't know when they're going to be connected and don't know the time frame for that. We've got people on the west coast of Tasmania that were going to get fibre to the home who are now, of course, not getting that. So there is great unrest in the Tasmanian community, and no matter where you look. So it is quite astonishing to have the Prime Minister in here today not fully and adequately answering questions in relation to the NBN, but even more bizarrely to have had the member for Lyons to come in and say it's great news. I was really surprised to listen to his speech today, really very surprised. And I'm sure that his constituents will be very surprised, because I certainly intend to tell them, Deputy Speaker. He can be rest assured that I will be out and about campaigning in his seat and ensuring that other Labor senators do the same about his comments on the NBN today. Because quite frankly, his electorate will not appreciate his comments in here on the NBN. They will not appreciate that what he said to them is good news, and they will not appreciate the mistruths and the lies they were told before the last election by members of the Liberal Party in black and white. In black and white, and not one occasion, but on several occasions. As I've said, in their economic plan for Tasmania, in letters to the editor and in media statements. Every single time the Tasmanians were told, don't worry, you'll get the same under us as you're getting under Labor. Well, of course, they now know that's not true, Deputy Speaker, and they're not very happy about it. They're not very happy about it at all. At all. It's interesting that the member for Bass and Braddon haven't come in to speak on this bill like the member for Lyons has. Perhaps they've been out talking to their constituents a little bit more. Perhaps they know from their constituents just what a terrible debacle it has been. And perhaps they also know that Tasmania is missing out on jobs of the future and the innovation jobs that Tasmania was expecting to receive thanks to being the first state to be fully connected to the real NBN. So to sum up, Deputy Speaker, clearly this government is in a mess with their NBN. Clearly what was promised before the last election is not being delivered. Clearly what the current Prime Minister, when he was Minister for Communications, said even when they came to government is not correct. And indeed, we have had very little explanation from either the Minister for Communications or the Prime Minister in this place, or the Minister representing the Minister for Communications, on what is really going on with the NBN. What is really going on with the NBN. And obviously, they have a very good reason to hide it. They have a good reason to hide it because they know that when the truth comes out, when people know just how far behind they're going to be, just what the blown out costs are going to be, that it will show just how badly The current Prime Minister mismanaged this. He had just one job as Minister for Communications, and that was to roll out the national broadband network and to do it within his promises, as he promised. And that has not been delivered, and frankly, he should be ashamed of his record.
The question is the bill be now read a second time. Just before I call the member for Shortland, the member for Shortland has suggested that she won't be going on after the next election. Is that correct? I'd just like to say to the member for Shortland that she's probably one of the hardest working, most diligent members of Parliament that I've seen in this place, not only in the Parliament and the Federation Chamber, but also in her committee work, and her commitment to her electorate and those who are, how can I say, least able to care for themselves across her electorate and across this nation has always been noticed, and you'll be sadly missed in this place.
Right. Now I've got to do a speech where I'm going to give the government a serve.
And you've also been a great political warrior for your party.
No, thank you very much, Mr
I
Deputy Speaker. I really appreciate your kind words. They mean a lot, and I think they'll mean a lot to the people of Shortland as well. So thank you. I know that they're very genuine, and I really appreciate you saying what you just said. Thank you very much. Now, on to business. Unfortunately, being a very strong advocate for my electorate, I have to stand in this House today and say the government has failed when it's come to the NBN. It has not delivered what they promised, and it has caused a lot of angst within Shortland electorate. Mr Deputy Speaker, the NBN has been very, very unreliable, and people have been exceptionally disappointed. And the legislation we have today before us, looking at the Vertigan panels, and those panels were assembled by the current Prime Minister in December 2013, is made up of former Liberal Party staff as advisors, and it's noted that it's been strident critics. It has noted the fact that it hasn't really delivered what it was put there for. Industry and consumer advocates have raised significant concerns with measures in this bill, and I can only judge this legislation against what has been delivered as far as the NBN is concerned. Mr Deputy Speaker, people have been contacting my office in droves. I was quite excited. Shortland electorate was one of the electorates in Australia that were going to really benefit from the rollout of the NBN. We were anticipating that we'd get fast-speed broadband. Disappointed that it was fibre to the node and copper to the house, but we actually thought that it would be better than what existed previously. But the really disappointing aspect of the NBN is, and the rollout, is the fact that it hasn't delivered the speeds that were promised, and in actual fact it's led for lots of heartache with people being without telephones, with people being without internet, and with people feeling quite isolated as a result of it. I'll start with an example that just before Christmas, when it first started rolling out, and a man who on a disability pension was having agreed to have his phone switched over to the NBN and his internet, and when the switchover took place, he was out of telephone, he was out any internet, and he had very poor mobility. So this man had to struggle, and I say struggle, down the street to a pay telephone. And he rang and appointments were made, and of course, as happens with this changeover, the appointment was broken, it wasn't kept. The person had absolutely no communication with the outside world. He didn't have a mobile phone. We talked to the provider, we talked to NBN, and it soon became very apparent to us that they weren't talking to each other. So I went up the back and bought a mobile phone. I was loading it up. We told the provider that I was going to post on my Facebook that they wouldn't even give him a mobile phone. And believe it or not, they actually delivered a mobile phone to him the day before Christmas. But it shouldn't come to that. And if I'm going to use the remainder of my time here to highlight some of the problems, I actually did an interview on ABC Central Coast this morning, and one of the issues that was raised was around the NBN, and it was the person that was interviewing raised the fact that not only the Central Coast but in Lake Macquarie there's been enormous problems. And he told me that he'd heard of a doctor who received information, and it was life-saving information, via the internet. Previously he had ADSL and he received it, but now he's got the NBN installed. He can't receive the data, and this is really important information. He has to make a split-second decision as to the treatment of a person, and that decision can influence that person's life into the future or influence the fact that that person will survive the incident. Now, the most common problem is the fact that the NBN isn't delivering the speeds that people were promised. That's one of the common problems. One of the constituents who has been in contact with my office quite frequently said that his NBN fluctuates between 95 MPS to 3 MPS a second. Took the top plan, 100 MPS, and despite paying the extra $30 to get the extra fast band, fast internet, he is not getting it. So he is very, very upset. He's a person that works from home and a person that has been having problems. Another problem is that the NBN connection keeps dropping out, and new modems are being supplied, yet the problem still continues. Internet not working after the NBN's been connected, and of course, once again, this is another person that has medical issues. And I cannot emphasise enough how many times we've contacted the service provider, and it doesn't matter which service provider it is. We contact the service provider, we contact the NBN, and yet the problem can't be solved. There's appointment after appointment organised with technicians, and they're broken. The technician's coming around to connect the NBN, and then the next minute, the appointment's cancelled, and another one set for the next day. One customer, it took 10 weeks between the phone call requesting and ordering the NBN, and this is a person that was very computer literate, and she, as of the beginning of February, still didn't have it installed. There's been NBN connected. This is another person, but no switchover, no service whatsoever. The fact that you've got people that are, particularly when it's an older person, that is living and are totally isolated, no telephone. and no NBN. I have had numerous people contact my office and ask to be switched back to the previous system, to the old system. And of course they can't. They can't be switched back. Now, I wouldn't be raising this issue and emphasising the absolute importance of it if the problems weren't as bad as they are. Members on the other side, I've heard talk about looking forward to the NBN coming to their area. Please, believe me, there's serious problems. You need to take it up with both the Prime Minister because it's his NBN. Don't for a moment think it's anyone else's. This rests with the Prime Minister. It's his plan, it's his scheme for the NBN. It needs to be taken up with him, and it needs to be taken up with the Communications Minister. You do not want this to be rolled out like this in your electorates. You do not want it. My staff have said to me that they think they should put a sign out the front, NBN Complaints Office. That is how bad it is. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I have in my hand here, and this is just a small number, I have over 80 complaints that we're working on in the office now. So it's not one, it's not two, it's just unbelievable how many people are experiencing problems. And the fact that people can end up with just a phone connection and no NBN connection, and then the provider and the NBN each blaming each other shows that it's a flawed system. And the fact that there's been so many problems in Shortland, which is an area that's fairly low-lying generally, and I believe a lot of the problem has been associated with the condition of the copper wires and the fact that that they're in such poor condition, and the fact that we all know that the government has been ordering more copper wire in from overseas, and the fact that we're getting such a poor deal with this NBN. I say to all Australians, look at it very carefully. At least when it comes to your areas, wait and see what happens before you connect, because it is fraught with problems. But this second-rate NBN will cost $41 billion, but it's gone up to $56 billion, and that's an increase of $15 billion. The fibre to the node is costing money. It's costing $55 million to fix the copper wires, and this is a system that's going to be obsolete nearly by the time it's rolled out across Australia. At its best, it can't deliver the speeds that's needed. And in those countries where they have gone down the line of fibre to the node and copper to the home, they're actually already moving to change to a different system. It is extremely worrying that at a particular time in our history, when we should be embracing new technologies, when we should be trying to make ourselves as globally competitive as we can, as the Prime Minister tells this House, it's an exciting time to be an Australian. We must be agile, we must be innovative, but we must have the tools. We must have the tools to be able to be innovative, to be able to compete. And until this government actually gets in there and fixes the problem, that's not going to happen. Now, on Saturday last week, I was outside the Belmont Medicare office, and Mr Deputy Speaker, I know you've got a Belmont Medicare office, but I'm quite sure the government isn't about to close your Belmont Medicare office. Mine opened at the same time as yours. And I was getting signatures for a petition, and people were lining up to sign the petitions that I had with me. And I had about half a dozen people with me, and there were lines all through the shopping centre with people falling over each other to sign the petitions. But the thing that really struck me was the number of people that came up to me and said, I have the NBN. I wish I'd never signed up to it. I have so many problems with it. We had a list of paper, we had a list with it, and we were taking names of people as they were signing petition. I really need the government to listen and to understand there is an enormous problem. It is vitally important that people can communicate with each other. We rely on the internet, we rely on a telephone. Without being able to communicate effectively, people are isolated. Without being able to communicate effectively, then we as a nation will go down the drain. Mr Deputy Speaker, if I'm down in the shopping centre raising an issue that's very important to people, they're signing up petitions about that, but at the same time they're complaining about the NBN and raising that as a major issue, the government needs to listen and act.
Thank you. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And it's hard to know how to limit your remarks to 15 minutes in this particular debate, because I could talk all day about the problems that we have had in my electorate in regards to the rollout of the NBN. Like the member for Shortland, I would like to take this opportunity to place on the record again the frustrations that Bendigo and Central Victoria have had because of the result of decisions that this government has made in regards to the NBN. So let's just for a moment stop and remember what they promised, this government, when in opposition, promised the people of Central Victoria, because they did pop up to Central Victoria quite a bit, including the then Shadow Minister for Communications, then the Minister for Communications, and now the Prime Minister. And what he promised in the lead up to the last election at a Bendigo Business Council event, the coalition plan would be cheaper, faster installed using fibre to the node technology rather than fibre to the premises, to the homes and businesses in Bendigo. That is what the Prime Minister said at the time to a Bendigo Business Council forum held on March 26, 2013. Well, here we are. Tomorrow is March the 1st, 2016, and no one in Bendigo has fibre to the node. This Prime Minister, when he was a Shadow Communications Minister, stood up at a Bendigo Business Council event and effectively lied, conned them. He said at the time that homes in Bendigo would get fibre to the node by 2016. Well, we're there. We are how many years on from that particular event, and we still do not have fast-speed broadband delivered in Bendigo. We do not have it in the way that it was promised by this government. What this government did when they got elected was they ripped up the plan, which would have seen Bendigo homes connected to fibre to the premises, the Labor plan. We would have got it under the Labor plan. It would be rolling out, as we speak, to the brown sites that we talk about. We would be getting it, but this government ripped up the plan, threw Bendigo off the map, and we are still waiting. But some in our area are a little bit, they're okay with that. They're like, well, if Labor wins the next election, can we get fibre to the driveway? This hidden concept. Can we get fibre to the premises? Because what the people in Bendigo know is that they can't trust this government even with their own plan. Because not only has it not been built, it's costing this country a fortune. Replacing copper. What kind of a joke of a government are you that you replace copper with copper? Why would you not admit it and go, all right, where we have to replace the copper, we'll go one step further, we'll replace it with fibre. We'll replace it with the cable that will actually deliver the internet speeds we need tomorrow and every day after tomorrow. What kind of ideologically arrogant government do we have that they replace copper with copper? Maybe it's because they've got friends in the copper industry and they want to throw them a bone and try and help their copper prices. But no other country in the world is doing what this government is doing and replacing copper with copper, and at the rate and the cost that it is. It wasn't just the Shadow Minister who was then became Prime Minister who came to Bendigo and made these promises. We also had the then opposition leader and now former Prime Minister make the same promises, that under a coalition by 2016 there will be a minimum download speeds of 25 megabits. We'll deliver 25 minimum megabits by the end of our first term. Well, the election is coming around the corner. The clock is ticking. People in the government benches think that it could be any day. We could go to a double dissolution election. But the people in Bendigo still do not have their NBN. Do you know what we do have in Bendigo? We have the advertising. The government didn't cancel the advertising contracts. We have NBN code trucks. We have Connect to the NBN advertising trucks. We have NBN advertising at our cinemas. We have NBN advertising in our newspapers. Geez, if I had the advertising budget of this government, if only people had the advertising budget of this government, you'd think that every house in Bendigo could connect, but they can't. The only houses that can connect to the NBN in Bendigo are the houses that could connect because of the decision of Labor government decisions. Because under Labor, our greenfield sites, our new estates, they get NBN fibre to the premises. Now, we aren't a growth area like Melbourne, so we don't have the big estates that are coming online like Melbourne, but some of our homes can connect to the NBN. We do have some towers built under Labor, switched on, that are connecting to the NBN. But not a result of any decision that this government has made, not as a result, but yet they stand in here and claim the credit that these homes are connecting because they connected under their watch, but it wasn't their decisions why these houses connected. What we also have in Bendigo is this government's failure to turn on towers. We have 4 NBN towers built in the northern part of the electorate that would have serviced homes and businesses and farms in the northern part of the electorate, built in 2013, but not switched on. How incompetent are you as a government to not switch on towers that were built? You claim to be people who care about business and be smart at business. Well, you've got to ask the question how you can build an asset and not switch it on to generate the revenue in which to make the asset sustainable going forward. The reason why they haven't been switched on is because the 5th tower, the relay tower, the tower at Mount Camel, was knocked back because of a planning reason. That was 12 months ago. Over 12 months ago, that tower was knocked back, and yet to this day, there is still not an engineering solution. We still cannot get a switch-on date for the people in that area affected. Now, there are lots of people in the Bendigo electorate who will, their delivery towards the internet, to getting the NBN, will be fixed wireless. But yet we have no confidence in this government in being able to deliver that plan because of what's happened in the north of the electorate, their failure to consult with the community, their failure to find an engineering solution, their failure to ensure that communities like Huntley, like Ladies Pass, like Gornong can actually connect to the NBN. The frustration that they have to look out their windows and to drive past NBN towers that have not been switched on. Yet this government are congratulating themselves for doing such a great job. And how great has their job been? Well, their so-called fabulous fibre to the node, it has been so successful that since they have been introduced fibre to the node, under 30,000 homes have been connected to it. That means every other home that's been connected has been because of Labor Party decisions that Labor made in government. You cannot claim somebody else's achievements or homework. It just doesn't work. And on this issue, the people in the regions will not be conned. They want access to the internet. They want access to the NBN so they can do their business. There is currently a massive digital divide between the country and the city, between the regions and the metro areas, and people are being left behind in the regions. You know, we don't even talk about being able to watch Netflix in central Victoria. We just want to be able to log on to the internet to read emails, to do homework, to do our on-course work for universities, because our universities are shutting down and moving to the metro areas. We just want to be able to have the internet to be able to upload our BAS statements on time and in real time. The people in the areas of central Victoria and regional Victoria aren't talking about internet speeds to be able to watch movies. They're talking about internet speeds to be able to do the decent basic, fundamental aspects of our life, because so much of our lives is online these days, yet we can't get decent fast-speed broadband. Some of the issues that have been raised, and in the few moments I'd have left, I'd just like to put on the record some of the issues that have been raised with me personally. Like the former Speaker, the member for Shortland, this is the issue that tops all other issues in my electorate: people's inability to connect to fast-speed broadband. Because under the Labor plan, we should be having rolled out right now fibre to the premises, Telstra stopped opening up new ports or adding in new ADSL ports into parts of the Bendigo electorate. Areas like Castlemaine, areas like Golden Square, where we've had a lot of growth and infilling and building going on within housing estates. But yet when they ring up to connect to the internet, they're told, sorry, there's no ports available. When you talk to Telstra, they say, well, that's because we're working to the NBN rollout plan and they should have access to the NBN right now. You can't blame Telstra for the fact that NBN Co have failed to build on time. So what it means is that for the people in Golden Square, Castlemaine and other parts of the electorate that can't get access to an ADSL port, they're told to rely on their mobile phone. People waiting 2 to 3 years to get access to ADSL because there is no available ports for them. They literally call up every day hoping that somebody's dropped off the list so they can go onto the list. If this government had kept its promise, then this would not be an issue. But they didn't. They ripped up the plan, they threw Bendigo off the map, and 2 years later we're back on and we're going to get inferior technology. So you can understand why the people of Central Victoria feel betrayed by this Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister when they came to Bendigo and made these promises, because they stood up and said they'd get it sooner, faster, quicker, cheaper. Well, it is wrong. Under the Labor plan, they'd have it rolling out down their streets right now, and under the Liberal plan, they have promises to sometime by 2018 to be able to connect. There's a problem too in parts of the area that still are not on the rollout map. So communities like Maiden Gully, growth area in Bendigo, is still not on this government's map. So the fact that they can't get ADSL, the fact that all I can say to them is, sorry, you're not on the map yet. Growth area, new schools, and they cannot get access to the internet. It's a disgrace and this government needs to fix it. In areas like Reedsdale, where they have a tower, for those who have access to the tower, they say it's great. Thank you very much, Labor, for building the tower. But we have a problem with the satellite service, because under this government, the satellite service has been oversubscribed. So in regional communities, farming communities, where you have 1 or 2 households who are supposed to rely on the satellite service, we also have entire townships like Queenstown in Tasmania being offered satellite service, a township of 3,000. So the people in Reedsdale say, how is that fair? How is it fair that Queenstown is accessing the same service as me? They're asking for a new tower to be built in their area so everybody in their area has access to towers. Then we have the famous Spencer Street, famous for all the wrong reasons. In this street, there are 4 different technologies, 5 if you include none at all. The 4 different technologies that they have been offered to connect to the internet, one street in one part of the electorate: ADSL 1, ADSL 2, mobile broadband and interim satellite. All of them say that their speeds are appalling and low. All of them say that they cannot connect to the internet to be able to do the basics. We also have Newham, where we have actually had some fairly constructive meetings with NBN Co, who've indicated that they want to build 2 towers. Now, learning from the mistakes of Mount Camel, we've been able to convince NBN Co to come and meet with us to talk about where to put the 2 towers in Newham. Now, they're referred to as the South and North Tower, and we are hopeful that they will be built and be connected. But we have problems with other parts of the electorate not able to connect to fast-speed, reliable broadband. We have large parts of the electorate, as I've mentioned, like Maldon, the great township of Maldon, places like Maiden Gully, who are still not on the map, and we still have issues with towers that have not been switched on. And the experiences that we hear from people. From Kangaroo Flat, Darren Williams, who has access to no ADSL. A short email about the internet services in central Victoria. We purchased a block of land in Kangaroo Flat. It was not an old subdivision, and we built our home. The email ends up being a very long email that describes their experiences about trying to connect to the ADSL. We have from Strathfield State, Bronwyn Gibbs, who speaks about the digital divide. She used to live in an area where the NBN was being delivered and then moved into Strathfield State. And she said it was like going back a decade. It was like a time walk going from NBN to ADSL. We have lots of students that contact us to talk about how they can't do their homework. They can't log on to do their homework because of lack of access to fast-speed broadband. This government doesn't really care about the regions. They don't really care about ensuring that there is no digital divide in this country. This government doesn't really commit to ensuring that everybody has access to fast-speed broadband. They are not in the interest of building a nation. They are not in the interest of nation-building projects. And this bill and what it's trying to do, at the end of the day, doesn't address the real issues when it comes to the...
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. You know, of all the things that the Abbott-Turnbull government has done over the last 2.5 years, it's the trashing of the NBN, which completely boggles my mind. Every time I think about it, I'm just stunned by the stupidity and the incompetence that we've seen by the current Prime Minister in his previous role as Minister for Communications and since he became Prime Minister. And I'm including walking away from action on climate change when I make that statement, so it's a big statement to make that the NBN and the trashing of it is one of the most stupid things I've seen any government do. And I sit here on this side of the House and I go home to my electorate and I see businesses that can't work from home. I see kids that can't download work for homework. I see schools where only one kid can be online at a time, and I'm astonished at the stupidity, just astonished. I hear this Prime Minister get up day after day and talk about our house as our biggest asset. And if you're a bit older and you've paid for your house and you have it, and you're sort of heading towards retirement, if you're the generation of the Prime Minister and me, maybe that's true. But if you're younger, if you're starting life or you're in the 20s and your 30s, your biggest asset is actually your capacity to earn. Your biggest economic asset is your capacity to earn. That allows you one day maybe to get a house and it allows you to pay it off, but that earning capacity is actually your biggest asset when you're young. We have a government that slashes education spending. We have a government that destroys the TAFE system. We have a government that makes degrees unaffordable. We have a government that rips up the very infrastructure that we need as a nation to earn. We are being seriously left behind by our neighbours, by the rest of the world. We have been for quite some time. We have been for over a decade. We have been getting further and further and further behind, and our internet speeds are getting worse and worse and worse relative to those around us who had the foresight to do something about it before we did. And we came to government in 2007 and we decided to change that. And we started embarking on an infrastructure project that would have put this nation where it needed to be for 50 to 70 years into the future. We started building the infrastructure that we needed for the future, not the infrastructure that we needed for a decade ago, not the infrastructure that we need to download videos and film, but the technology we need to work in remote locations, to work through the internet rather than the same office, to conduct e-health in regional centres, for people to phone in their results. We don't even know what the NBN will be used for in the future, just as we didn't know what telephone lines would be used for when we connected them right across the country nearly a century ago. This decision by this government is as illogical as the one that was made when we built rail lines. And for those of you who remember your primary school, there were several gauges. There was a Queensland gauge, I think it was 3'6", if I remember correctly. 3'6" member for Chifley might know. You were at primary school more recently than I was, member for Chifley. 3'6" in Queensland, I think 4'8.5" in New South Wales, and 5'2", I think, in Victoria. So every time a train crossed a state border, they had to. Yeah, that's right. It was crazy, but they had an excuse at the time because they were different states, so different people made decisions. But this government for the last 2.5 years has had total control of this. And again, the decision, to go back to copper when the rest of the world is going fibre to the home, the decision to start rolling out copper, to start repairing copper, is extraordinary. And yet they did it. It's just beggars belief. It totally and absolutely beggars belief. Now, we know that when Prime Minister Abbott gave the NBN, handed it over to the Minister for Communication, the then Minister for Communications, he was instructed to demolish the NBN. We know that. We know that that was the instruction that was given. And, on command, the now Prime Minister did just that. But there is no excuse when he became Prime Minister and he was in total control of allowing this particular piece of infrastructure to go down the path that it is going. And let's look at what he did at the time. He appointed Liberal staffers, Liberal Party advisors and strident critics of the NBN to a committee to investigate what to do about the NBN. He basically put saboteurs in charge of policy development. And in an absurdly pessimistic quantification by that committee based its analysis on the ridiculous idea that by 2023, the average household would only want 15 megabits per second. In 2023, it's not enough now. It's not enough now. It's also, by the way, what we average now. But it's not enough now. It's not even enough to do the things we know that people want to do. It's not fast enough, for decent Netflix. It's actually not fast enough even now. And they put forward this ridiculous qualification that households would only be wanting 15 megabits per second by 2023. That's an extraordinary assertion by what was known as the Vertigan panel. And then the government, of course, proceeded to put together this shonky, low-tech version of an NBN, dared continue to call it a national broadband network, even though it's nowhere near it. We still have copper being rolled out down the street in Carlingford, and we've now seen it blow out. This minister who said it would be delivered faster, it'd be cheaper, it'd be sooner, got it all completely and totally wrong. The second-rate NBN will cost, he estimated it would cost 41 billion, it's now costing 56 billion. That's a 37% blowout. The fibre to the node was estimated to cost $600 per home, it's now blown out to $1,600 per home. That's a 167% blowout, or $1,000 per home. They budgeted 55 million to fix up the copper. It's now 641 million to fix up the copper and growing. And it's that fixing up of the copper that is delaying things so incredibly badly. 641 million to fix up copper. It's cheaper to roll out fibre. It's cheaper to actually do it the right way. It would have cost less now, and it will certainly cost less than the maintenance that will go into upgrading last century's system. They're rolling out last century's system, and all this century we're going to pay to repair it. This is absurd. They estimated they'd have 2.61 million homes connected to the NBN by 2016, and they'll only have between 10,800 and 75,000 by December at the end of this year. They said, by the way, that every home would have 25 megabits per second minimum by the end of 2016. Well, Parramatta's not even on the map for 2016. We were, under the old plan, under the previous government, Parramatta, as you'd expect, a CBD, the centre of one of the largest economies in Australia, 80,000 small businesses surrounding Western Sydney. You'd expect that Parramatta would actually be on the list quite early. It was on the list for 2016, got ripped off the list pretty quickly when the government changed. I think North Sydney got added instead. Parramatta went, North Sydney went on. And now in 2016, even though every household is supposed to have 25 megabits per second by the end of this year, we're not even on the map. We are not even on the map. Parramatta, the second CBD in Sydney, not even on the map. And I tell you, Deputy Speaker, go around and talk to small business in Parramatta and big business for that matter, and it's the first thing they talk about, this essential infrastructure. This isn't some, glamorous, opt-in, opt-out technology we're talking about here. This is the basic communication system for the world. And when the Prime Minister gets up here and talks about services being exported to Asia and how wonderful all of that is, when he gets up and talks about, this wonderful world of the future and the sharing economy and startups, this is the base of all that. You can't have that. You can't have a sharing economy if people actually can't get online and get decent speeds. If you don't have decent speeds, if you don't have a critical mass, of fibre, then you won't have entrepreneurs working, as hard as they could to develop new ways to use it, because we won't have the critical mass. If you don't have the population on fibre, then you will not have the kind of innovation that we need if we want to own the products of the future. You will not have people in country towns providing services to Asia if they're still, essentially, let's face it, it's pretty close to dial-up. Deputy Speaker, I was out in a country town, I was out in Pemboka just a couple of years ago. It's not in the middle of nowhere, it's between Canberra and the snow, right? It's not in the middle of nowhere. It's a few hours away, and there's a town there, and I went into an art gallery, which someone had just opened, and I found these beautiful pottery cups, and I thought I'd buy them. I thought, nice gallery. He took half an hour to take my credit card transaction. He ended up walking out into the middle of the field and holding it up, trying to get signal. And if I didn't actually really want the cups and feel sorry for this guy who'd just started a business in a place where he couldn't take credit card transactions, I would have walked out. If it had been Sydney, I wouldn't have waited half an hour. But I waited half an hour for this small business in a reasonably located country town to wander around holding his credit card device in the air, trying to get signal, in the paddock. In the paddock. I mean, this is what this government is leaving people with. This is what this government... You can hear the member for Indi talk about her NBN because they got the real one. They got the real one. And she came in here today and talked about how fabulous it was because she got the real one. Then have a listen to the member for Shortland, have a listen to the member for Bendigo, have a listen to any member who's had this shonky, second-rate, last century... I'm not even going to call it the NBN because it's not. This shonky infrastructure rolled out in their electorate, and they will tell you what a mess it is. They will tell you that as soon as the kids come home from school and log on to do their homework, forget it. Your speed is out the window. Unless you get on between 11 and 2 when no one's home, forget it. Now, if you happen to be a small business, if you happen to be working from home, and we want people to do that, by the way, Deputy Speaker, we actually want these hubs where people, work closer to home. We don't want everyone getting in their car and unnecessarily driving into an office in the city because they don't have broadband and the internet connection's not fast enough, so they have to continue to do that, and we keep upgrading the roads and the public transport system to cope with thousands, tens of thousands of people unnecessarily travelling. We want people to be able to work from home, but how on earth does a small business that relies on upload and download do it if they're getting speeds of 5 megabits per second and less? And in Parramatta, that's what we get. That's what we get. I surveyed my community last year and I asked them to go on and test their NBN connections. Now, the worst was the suburb of Marylands. They're getting speeds as low as 0.14 megabits per second download. Upload's just not... 0.14 megabits per second. It's so slow that it kind of, it's not worth talking about. In fact, the Parramatta Advertiser quite correctly said it's faster to phone a friend in the Congo who has an average speed of 1.75 megabits per second and have them read the article to you. And that's actually true. If you live in Marylands, it's faster to phone the Congo because the Congo's got faster download speeds as you. In fact, it's interesting to see who does have faster download speeds than us. I mean, I actually printed out the list today because it was so sort of extraordinary. We are currently ranked between 44th and 46th, depending on who you talk to. In fact, we've gone backwards while we build the NBN because our NBN is rubbish and the rest of the world is building good stuff. So they're building faster fibre, we're building rubbish, we're going backwards. We're spending $46 billion and we're going backwards. This is absurd. The once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get this right, and we are spending money to go backwards relative to countries like, and I found a few countries that have faster, relative to countries like, these are all better than us, higher on the list, the 10 above us, Qatar, Madagascar, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Vietnam, Thailand, Poland, Slovenia, Ukraine. They're the ones that are just above us on the list. And if you start to get to upload speeds, and by the way, business has to upload, and so does health, e-services has to upload, so it's not just download speeds. If you want to find someone that's lower than Australia's average of 3.89 megabits per second upload, you want to find countries that are slower than that, you have to go to Senegal, Jamaica, Argentina, Colombia, Fiji, Montenegro, Italy, Croatia, Faroe Islands, Turkey, Serbia and Oman. They're the countries that are slower than us on upload speeds. And yet we have a Prime Minister that comes in here and dares talk about innovation, but does not provide the basic infrastructure, that spends $46 billion building something that will not support even basic level innovation. In fact, it won't even support what we already know. It won't even support what we already know we're going to do with this technology. It won't support working from home. It won't support, even basic movie download. It certainly won't support basic e-health at all. I mean, this is a shambles. This government, if there was ever any example of a government that can't run a raffle, this is it. This is a government that took a great project and turned it into the most massive waste of both money and opportunity this country will probably ever see.
Shuffled around a fair bit.
Call the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I just to talk about the National Broadband Network very quickly. I won't use the whole amount of time, but I just want to reflect on what is the role of public investment, what is the role of private investment, because ultimately I'm a strong believer that technology is overtaking us and wireless will be the way that everyone wants to go. Now, they might laugh at me, but if you look at national broadband networks that are being built around the world, people are accessing their technology through wireless. They simply are not accessing their technology through fibre as the long-term program. If you look at how people are, even with this iPad now and this iPhone, what I can access on my mobile device really is quite critical. Now, I can't help but think that when we compare NBN in different parts of the world to compare us, most of the countries that have superior national broadband networks have not been built by their governments, they've been built by private investment. And there is nothing like private investment to actually get things done. And what we saw when the NBN was first announced was that all private investment stopped. In fact, the township that I represent in Horsham, which had NBN promised that wasn't delivered in a time frame and still hasn't been delivered, has been really lacking because Telstra essentially stopped putting exchange ports for ADSL. They stopped putting fibre. The area that was never flagged was Mildura, and that is where private investment came in and built a fibre network and actually has reasonably good fibre in the main investment hub. So the irony of it is the way forward of the future, whether we like it or not, is that there should be some fibre to businesses in our main business centres, but people are choosing to access through wireless. And I just put the alternate view that no one has ever talked about. What would Australia look like if a commitment of $37 billion had been spent to subsidise a mobile phone and wireless technology right across Australia? You would have people in my electorate who would be able to use their phones to take scans of different things in their vineyards and be able to upload those. Wireless is the way that people are heading, and I think that what we're actually building is technology that won't be seen as first world in the future. I think it'll be technology that will be seen as yesterday's technology, and by the time it is built, and admittedly it is taking time, and I hear lots of banter from very, very candid people on one side of the chamber and candid people on the other, but I think by the time it is built, we'll reflect on it and say if we'd spent the same money on wireless technology, we'd have something that would have taken us into the future rather than what we're going to have and eventually might have in the years to come. Thank you.
Look, I thank the member for Mallee. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Chifley.
Deputy Speaker, that is the kind of thinking in relation to telecommunications in this country.
He will quietly go about his presentation.
That has condemned, or I should say, consigned those opposite to mistakes for years on broadband. In fact, I would say the Prime Minister, from the top down, they all suffer from reverse broadband Midas touch. Every time they touch broadband, they stuff it up. And that argument made by the member for Mallee is a clear example. And to be fair to you, member for Mallee, you're not the first one to say it, because the first one to try and argue this line, is your Prime Minister himself, who way back when he was first appointed as the then opposition communications shadow minister, said, and this is in the Paddy Manning book, the biography of Malcolm Turnbull, and he says, and I quote, "For all his industry experience, some of Turnbull's early steps were amateurish. At first, he appeared to line up with his leader, believing the whole world was going wireless and this would make FTTP redundant." That was the argument back then, member for Mallee. And he said here, and this is in an op-ed that he'd written, "Wireless broadband has been growing at nearly 10 times the rate of fixed line, whose penetration has remained fairly static. The convenience and flexibility of wireless is compelling and likely to become more so. It'll be a fierce competitor with the new network." Now, this was the canard. This was the dummy argument being put out so you wouldn't roll out fibre, you just rely on wireless. So what's the truth? The truth, however, I just said it. Listen to me and you'll learn. The truth, however, was that the explosive growth in wireless was dependent on fixed-line technology, and price-sensitive consumers were going to be careful to avoid heavy use of data over 4G mobile networks that would be far more expensive per megabyte. And that is the point. When you use wireless, it costs you more. So what you're arguing on behalf of your constituents is for them to pay more rather than to get a better service delivered either through fixed line, through optic fibre to their home. There would be a mix of wireless and there'd be a mix of satellite. So that was argument number one. And by the way, the Nationals in this debate, I mean, when I think of the fact that this legislation will break down the notion that you would have uniform pricing and that you as a National Party member could come into this place and not bat an eyelid to the fact that it'll break it down to make it more expensive in the regions and the cities. When I think of the fact that you're sitting on the sideline not saying a single word about that, I'm reminded of that saying, thank God for the starch in your shirts because your spines aren't holding you up. Because you are not defending your constituency whatsoever. When you fail to speak in this debate and point out the fact to your own constituents that you are letting them down, that you are being a sellout and that you are being the best doormat that the Liberal Party could have in letting them get away with this, it is astounding. And then you come up here with an argument saying, oh, we should just go wireless. Wireless would be way better. What you need in your regions is better broadband. Wireless will fix some of it for those areas that are hard to fibre up, but your main aim should be, like what we were saying when we were in government, 93% fibre to the premises, because everything else is a sad joke and you are going to have to play catch-up at some point. And that wasn't the first mistake that Malcolm Turnbull made. The other mistake that he made, and again I say this for the benefit of our great friends in the National Party, because they use this argument as well, the other mistake that he made was that he tried to criticise the need for the 2 satellites that we had commissioned when we were in government. Planned to launch in 2015, delivering fast broadband to about 200,000 homes in the most remote communities, member for Mallee. Now, he tried to bag us out for that and then realised that because of the huge demand out in the regions, that this was actually a good idea. Then tried to argue that we had not planned for properly with this satellite service because it was oversubscribed. And there was a reason why it was oversubscribed. When people in the regions, and I know this from talking with people in the regions, when they heard the speeds that they could get for download and upload compared to what they were getting, they were flocking to use that. They were flocking to use it. They were flocking to use a satellite service that had been bagged out by the coalition. How in their minds they could bag out a satellite service that would deliver better better broadband for their constituents is astounding, but it doesn't surprise me when the Nationals fail to come in here and stand up for the regions on broadband, and they're fixated. Their big fixation in this debate is mobile phone towers, and that's the extent of telecommunications reform and improvement in infrastructure from the Nationals' perspective. No wonder the Liberals walk all over you when you don't have the intellectual grunt to be able to step up, put the argument forward for your regions, and it's Labor that's arguing for the regions, not only to get the access to the infrastructure, but to make sure that the wholesale price is uniform and that you are not penalised by virtue of the fact you live in the regions.
When you use the word
and I take on board your point, Deputy Speaker.
Referring to me, and I don't like to be walked over.
I would not even imagine to try and do that to your good self. And I have huge respect for the Deputy Speaker, but I have even greater respect for the people that he and some of the regional members represent in this place, and I frankly think that more needs to be done for the regions to improve telecommunications availability, in particular broadband. So, as I said, there were some fundamental errors right at the get-go from the way in which the now Prime Minister, then Shadow Communications Minister, approached this. He also tried to talk it down, saying it was just going to be a video delivery service, mimicking the former Prime Minister and member for Wirringa, not realising that most projections for data growth across the planet were showing that data would grow at a phenomenal rate and you needed a network to be able to actually manage that data growth. And here we were, having a coalition arguing the best contribution they could make was to dumb down the network and dumb down the argument about supporting a better network, trying to weave it into all their usual attack, all the usual spin, and public policy as a result of this has suffered, and importantly, not only Labor constituents have suffered, but importantly coalition ones, particularly in the regions, have suffered as a result as well. Because remember, there was a point at which the coalition said, we will make sure that we look after the worst affected and we'll prioritise them in the rollout. Well, like every other promise that's been made in this debate by the coalition, that went by the wayside as well. So did the promise that by the end of this year, 2016, everyone will get access to at least 25 megabits per second download, and that would be 50 megabits off the top of my head by 2019. That went as well. The other thing too, which is noteworthy, is that the former CEO, who had been hounded by the Prime Minister, whose reputation had been completely trashed by the Prime Minister when he was the Shadow Communications Minister, an outrageous bullying of the then CEO. Now that CEO has taken the time to actually analyse where we're at, because what has appeared to have occurred is that there has been a $15 billion blowout in the total cost of the NBN project since the coalition's come to government. And what has happened is there's been a review of how that could possibly be the case. And the paper that was put forward by Mike Quigley analyses the difference in the cost of the various parts of the NBN between the 2013 strategic review and the 2016 corporate plan. And it finds in round figures that the cost of rolling fibre to existing premises fell from $14 billion to $11 billion. The cost of rolling fibre to new premises fell from $3 billion to $2 billion. And the combined cost of the fixed wireless and satellite components of the rollout fell $6 billion to $4 billion. So it's not on those bases, on the existing configuration of the network that Labor had commenced and was carried over by the coalition, those costs fell. The cost of the transit network, the backbone of the NBN, virtually unchanged, $1.5 billion, only up by $100 million, and it leaves the HFC and fibre to the node networks as the only possible cause of the blowout. And Mike Quigley writes, HFC and fibre to the node are the real culprits of the $15 billion increase, not previous management, not inadequate financial systems, not hidden costs in the FTTP rollout. Now, the Prime Minister's consistently talked up the cost and time taken up to roll out fibre to the premises and talked down the costs of rolling out fibre to the node and HFC, but as Mike Quigley says, the chickens are coming to roost, and the delay and extra expense involved in the renegotiation of the definitive agreements with Telstra, mind you, we were told that was only going to take 6 months. Wrong. That took way longer. The cost to roll out HFC and fibre to the node in the timescales that the coalition promised, grossly underestimated, and that's largely why we're seeing a $15 billion increase. So on every measure, on all the key measures, the coalition has got it wrong. As I said, they've got this reverse Midas touch when it comes to broadband. Every time they touch it, they stuff it up. So let's go. Second-rate NBN will cost $41 billion. That's what the strategic review said. Reality, after 2 years, the second-rate NBN cost $56 billion, up $15 billion. Strategic review said fibre to the node would cost per home $600. 2 years later, fibre to the node cost per home $1,600, up $1,000 per home, or nearly 200%. The strategic review reckoned that it would take $55 million to fix up copper. The reality is $641 million, up nearly $600 million, over 1,000%. The claim in the strategic review that 2.6 million homes would be connected to NBN pay TV by December 2016, wrong again, because only between 10,000 and 875,000 homes would be connected by December this year. That's down 1.7 million to 2.6 million homes, roughly 66% to 100% lower. Revenue. They reckon that they were going to rake in $2.5 billion revenue in 2016-17, and it's only it's been estimated 2 years on, $1.1 billion revenue in 2016-17, down $1.4 billion. IT capex, it was estimated would be a shade under $2 billion. It's over $2.5 billion, so it's increased as well. All the measures, wrong, continuously on what they're doing. And as the Shadow Communications Minister said, in any other circumstance where you had performed so poorly, you would expect a demotion, but the Communications Minister, after stuffing up the NBN, after exhibiting his reverse Midas touch on broadband, doesn't get demoted, he gets promoted to the top job of the land. And you see all the ways in which he's affected the NBN rollout, and he's cheered on, as I said before, by the National Party, who go on and just swallow this line that they're doing well when on every single measure they're not, and this bill makes it even worse. Waters down the consumer safeguards, waters down the ability to get uniform pricing, has been criticised by industry, and is yet another example when you look at all the things from the moment that the Prime Minister took on the job of Shadow Communications Minister, made those errors, kept compounding them, making promises that he could not conceivably keep, which when he made the promise of 25 megabits per second download speeds by December 2016, within 12 weeks of getting the job of going from Shadow Communications Minister to Communications Minister, in 12 weeks, the promise that he made that everyone would get faster download speeds, that he would get at least 25 megabits per second by 2016, he came into this chamber and right over there admitted he would not be able to keep his promise. Some people would say it was a lie, but what I reckon it was a demonstration all along that they continually made promises that they had no capability of being able to extend to the Australian public. They had not had the full rigour and testing of whether or not they could feasibly extend that commitment to the Australian people. They led people on that they could deliver this faster, cheaper and better than what was on offer at the time, and they have failed on all those counts. This is an outrageous, an absolutely outrageous way not only to treat the Australian people, but to condemn them to poor service when we are in an age where service needs to improve, not just be more of the same or worse, where countries are overtaking us in the quality of the broadband network, where countries are using good broadband to be able to support the type of innovative activity required to diversify economies, create new jobs, generate new wealth. These are the type of things that happen when you allow the broadband network to degrade. But to be fair to the Prime Minister, it's not just him, it's the entire coalition. Their sorry state, when you look at the 19 times they tried to fix broadband in the Howard government and failed, They then came up with a dodgy policy leading into the 2010 election, and then everything else since the Shadow Communications Minister and now Prime Minister has been in place has shown everything he has done has been terrible, and we have suffered as a result of it.
The member's time has expired. The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Moreton.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Access Regime and NBN Companies Bill 2015. But before I talk about this misguided and ideological attempt by the Turnbull-Joyce government to roll back a number of competition and consumer-friendly reforms that underpin the Labor's national broadband network, I wish to put it in a little bit of context. I do so, obviously, from that context of Australia being an island nation reasonably far removed from most of the population centres in the world. Now, this is important because it illustrates of how important it is that we get our communications with the rest of the world correct. We also need to focus on that because we are a country that values higher wages. We have a welfare net, and we have going back to the harvester cases when it comes to industrial law, we say that our workers are not slaves, they need a decent return. That's the context of Australia. And that's why Labor governments for the last 40, 50 years have always focused on getting the productivity gains right when in government. We do so in the context of protecting wages, but making sure that Australia can compete with the rest of the world whilst maintaining those high wages. And how do you do that? In 2016, in the middle of the digital revolution, in the age of technology, you make sure you invest in communications. And we know how important this is. In fact, I was a member of the 43rd Parliament, a minority government under Prime Minister Gillard, a minority government that only came to power when the independents who represented the bush saw the benefits of the national broadband network. And I know when Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott came to looking at, in a dry, empirical way, looking at what the parties had on offer, what tipped it towards those two independents was the national broadband network. Why? Because the NBN, as planned by Labor, delivers for the bush. Now, unfortunately, the bloke that missed out was the member for Warringah. He didn't understand the NBN. He was proud of the fact that he was a Luddite when it came to technology. He was proud to say yes, he still writes longhand. I think it was not necessarily with a nib and paintbrush or anything, but he was proud of the fact that he was not savvy. However, when he missed out on government because of the national broadband network, I think in his mind it crystallised his concerns about the NBN. And so he effectively, when in the lead up to the 2013 election, when the polls were looking very good for him, he said, well, I have to do something to keep the bloke that he deposed as leader, keep him happy and keep him inside the tent. He'd indicated that he wanted to leave Parliament, which might have made the member for Warringah happy. Instead, he said, all right, well, you can be in charge of the communication portfolio. And this was, the member for Wentworth understood communications. He'd invested in it, he saw the benefits that flow from it, he understood the way of the world and where the world was heading in it when it comes to the digital revolution. He'd been involved in communications back when he was at university. So the member for Warringah basically appointed the member for Wentworth the role of sabotaging the NBN. And so we had all sorts of promises before the election, and then once Prime Minister Abbott was elected by the people of Australia in that democratic process, we had suddenly a change in approach to the national broadband network. We end up with something that is twice the price, twice the rollout time, half the speed, instead of taking that approach of Labor, of investing in fibre and getting it right, with what would be the largest infrastructure rollout in the history of Australia that would particularly benefit the bush, would particularly benefit the National Party heartland. Instead, we end up with this sabotage outfit. You know, when the Communications Minister, as he then was, the member for Wentworth, said, and I quote, "We are going to do a rigorous analysis. We'll get Infrastructure Australia to do an independent cost-benefit analysis." That was the promise he made to the Australian people. Instead, when he came to being in office, to actually having some chance to have a say over the national broadband network, instead what did he do? He appointed a panel that was full of former Liberal Party staffers, Liberal Party advisors and other noted public critics of Labor's national broadband network. And we see that the cost models that they relied on, this Vertigen panel, have been proven to be hopelessly wrong, as the government's second-rate NBN has blown out from the $41 billion assumed in December 2013, not that long ago, December 2013. Now, there's the latest NBN Co's August corporate plan is assuming a cost of $56 billion. So, as I said, nearly twice the price. And the possibilities that are there in terms of improving productivity are incredible. I mentioned the bush particularly, not only in education, because the bush schools would get the benefits first and foremost, but also when it comes to agriculture. Now, some people like to say that Australia will become the food bowl of Asia as the Asian century rolls out, and that those populations that we are closest to become our future markets. I'm a little more sceptical and think that we might become the delicatessen of Asia rather than the food bowl. But if you're a delicatessen, it's all about having niche markets. Now, our farmers are the best in the world, Maybe one or two countries that can compete with them when it comes to dryland agriculture and the like. But we still have to transport our food products to Asia, and we can only be that delicatessen if we have good communication opportunities. Rather than just growing stuff broadly, we have to be able to have some niche markets where people will pay a top dollar for it. That's the reality of being so far from some markets. We're not a part of the European Union where we can roll stuff out on trains. We're a long way from some of our Asian markets. So, the NBN brings great productivity gains for this nation. Instead, what have we seen? This second-rate NBN, not only where the cost has gone up from $29.5 billion up to $56 billion, they said that they'd have it rolled out to all homes in Australia by this year, by 2016. But what's the new time frame? They're now doubling that up to 2020. They said that their cut price NBN would cost, with second-rate copper, I should point out, would cost $600 per home. But now that's nearly tripled out to $1,600 a home. They said it would only cost about $55 million to patch up the old copper network. But now a 1,000% blowout, not a 10% blowout, not a 100% blowout, a 1,000% blowout to more than $640 million. He said that 2.61 million homes would be connected to the pay TV cables by 2016. Now NBN is forecasting they'll be connected to only 10,000 homes by June 2016. Yet this was an infrastructure plan and commitment and a promise that many people in my electorate relied on. I remember the candidates' debate in the 2013 election where the number one issue for businesses in Moreton was the access to the NBN. The number one issue. Because it didn't matter what the business was, they saw the opportunities. Like the Communications Minister actually did. I can understand the member for Warringah. I know he doesn't get technology. We saw that horrific interview with the hologram of Sonny Bill Williams. We still remember that. But the member for Wentworth the Prime Minister, the former Communications Minister, does get the NBN. He does understand it. I can understand the member for Warringah being upset about how the NBN cost him the Prime Ministership. It was so close, but not just exceeded his grasp. And then after that significant defeat, not to even sit in office for 2 years, not to ever actually enter the gates of the Lodge as Prime Minister before he was knifed in the back in the middle of the night. Sadly, the NBN that this Prime Minister, the former communications spokesperson for the Liberal and National parties, is overseeing a sham. They said it would bring this second-rate network that they promised to the Australian people would bring in $2.5 billion in revenue in 2016 and 2017. Now, what are they forecasting? $1.1 billion. So he's blown a $1.4 billion hole in the NBN company's revenue line. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Yet today in question time he dared to mention the global financial crisis response that was rolled out by the Labor Party. He dared to mention that with these sorts of projections and targets and the way that they hit them, it's unbelievable. They said, and I do lay a lot of the blame at this panel that was appointed, by the minister. The assumptions they made are unbelievable. They assumed, people that are watching this on the web, they assumed that the median household in Australia would require only 15 megabits per second by 2023. Already, 67% of Australians on the NBN are already ordering speeds higher than this. As I said, the Labor plan was to use fibre, to do it once and to do it right. The sabotage that has taken place when it comes to Australia's biggest infrastructure program is almost criminal. In terms of rolling out a project that was in the nation's interest, rolling out a program that was going to boost productivity, boost education, boost things for farmers, for manufacturers, for so many people in Australia. Instead, we had an ideological obsession by the member for Wentworth, the member for Warringah, and then for him to co-opt the member for Wentworth, who understood the benefits that would flow, who was happy to invest in French fibre, but to simultaneously be sabotaging French telecommunication companies that were relying on fibre. He was happy to do that. He saw the benefits there that would flow while he was investing in those Cayman Island, what was it? Work, save, invest in the Caymans. While he was doing that, but when it came to the Australian nation's, the national interests, he wasn't prepared to let Australia get the right thing. So for him to be co-opted into this ideological slight that was visited on the former Prime Minister is reprehensible. That takes a special types of flexibility to be able to sign up for such a sabotage job. Now, Mr Speaker, the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Access Regime and NBN Companies Bill is too heavily reliant on the recommendations coming out of the Vertigen panel. As I said, this group of former Liberal Party staffers, Liberal Party advisors and people that were always critical of the NBN, appointed by the member for Wentworth so that they would tell him exactly what he wanted to hear. And I note that the industry response to this piece of legislation before the Parliament has been scathing. They've pointed to the risk of consumer detriment from the proposed measures, which, as I said, are basically about rolling back a number of competition reforms and consumer-friendly reforms. Why shouldn't the Australian people know what's happening to their NBN? As I said, the biggest infrastructure investment ever by Australia, leaving aside some of the things invested in World War II in terms of the military response. So the Australian people deserve for the government to make this information available. We need to know this simple information. like the total capex, the total opex, the total revenue, and the amount of interest that NBN company will pay. What has this government got to hide? Is it their shame? Is it their embarrassment? To let the National Party particularly should be speaking up on this topic, because the NBN will give incredible benefits, Mr Speaker, for the bush. That's where the productivity gains will come, not only in education establishments in the bush, but also in our farms. And the government needs to reconsider this attempt to hide from the Australian people their horrible NBN piece of infrastructure.
Yeah.
However, do you want me to keep going?
I was for a second, but we're almost there.
Deputy Speaker, I believe that we can do better. We can do better.
It being 9 p.m, I propose the question that the House do now adjourn. I call the member for Holt.